Hi, in this video we'll take a look at RBF Drivers, an exciting new add-on for Blender. In a nutshell, RBF Drivers will help you create complex relationships and interactions between objects, armature bones, and other properties. Here are some things that you can achieve using this add-on. I'll do my best to tell you what RBF drivers are, how they fit in the Blender workflow, and give you a tour of the interface and the main functions. Just give me 30 seconds to explain a few things that I think will be important to some people, and then we can dive in. First, this is a paid add-on. It is available on Gumroad and the Blender market. If you already own the add-on, if you already bought it, then this video can serve as a quick start guide. Or you can watch it to get an idea what RBF drivers are all about. If this presentation helps you make a purchasing decision, you can do me a huge favor and click on the link that I'll share in the video description, and that way I'll receive a commission, but the price for you will be the same. And I'm working closely with James, the creator of RBF drivers, and he's also checking the information that I present. Okay, let's move on. So what is RBF? RBF stands for Radial Basis Functions, and a relatively simple definition can read something like this quote that I have displayed now. Fortunately, we don't have to understand what any of this means. We just need to understand how the implementation of RBF works in Blender, what it can do and what it can't do, and then we can benefit from this system. As I said in the beginning, on a practical level, RBF drivers is a new way to create complex relationships between objects in Blender. So it makes sense to compare it to other tools that we already use to create automatic relationships that can help us understand why we need a new system and where it would fit in our workflow. So in Blender we have parenting, constraints, drivers, and I guess we can add scripting to the list, whether that's a direct Python script or using a node-based system like animation nodes or Sverchok. And I compared these tools from a couple of different angles. Of course, this type of comparison is imperfect. It's a generalization, but I think it can be helpful. So next I'll introduce you to the basics of RBF drivers, and after that we'll come back to these graphs and we'll see how this add-on compares to existing tools and if it even makes sense to compare it. Let's start with the installation. Like most Blender add-ons, RBF drivers is easy to install. After you buy the add-on, you'll be able to download a zip file that contains the add-on. Do not unzip this file, just place it in a folder somewhere on your hard drive. Then in Blender you would go to Edit, Preferences, go to the Add-ons tab and click Install. Then you would navigate to the folder where you saved your zip file. I have a special folder called Blender Scripts where I place all of my scripts. That folder has become a little bit messy, but if I just search for RBF, it will pop up and I can select it and click Install Add-on and then just tick the checkbox and that will activate the add-on. And that's it. As I said, there is nothing special about the installation process. Now we can try to create a little example. Here I have a new empty Blender scene. And the first thing I'm going to add right away is an armature object. So Shift-A, armature, single bone. RBF drivers uses bones in pose mode as drivers. I'm going to talk more about that later. And with this bone, we can drive other bone properties and other object properties. Again, I'll talk more about what can be driven in a minute. For now, let's focus on setting up this simple example. I'm also going to add a monkey to the scene. It can be any other object that you like. It doesn't matter. And I'm going to move Suzanne to the side. And let's start setting up an RBF driver. So select the armature, go to pose mode and switch to bone tab. You can close all of these panels and around the bottom you'll see RBF drivers. I can expand it and I'm going to make sure that my bone is selected and active in pose mode. And now if I look in my RBF drivers panel, all I'll see is an add button. Let's click on it and we have a couple of options, but the only one that is active is new. There are other options to paste existing drivers. We'll probably talk about this in another video. So for now, just click new. and that will make the RBF Drivers interface appear here in this panel. So you'll see that we have drivers, some settings, inputs, driven properties, and poses. And by the way, this is the entire interface of the add-on. I feel that I have to say this explicitly. I generally don't like that Blender add-ons get integrated into the main interface. That is a problem with Blender itself, at least I experience it as a problem. But when I install a new add-on, I always find it a bit difficult to actually discover the functions of this new tool. I'm always asking myself, is the add-on hiding some additional features in the end panel or somewhere else? That happens a lot. But in this case, this is where we're going to work with RBF drivers. So at the top of the interface, we have an item that says RBF driver. And that's just the default name of the first driver that is created. You can double click it and rename it if you wanted to. You can press the plus sign to add more drivers or the minus button to delete them. That is pretty much the same as any other similar menu in Blender. We have the option to copy drivers and then paste them. Again, that is something that I'll probably not going to talk much in this video. For this simple example, I'm just going to work with one driver. As you can see, the driver is highlighted in red, and that means that it is not ready to use yet. We have to set up inputs, driven properties, and poses, and then we'll be able to activate the driver. So below our driver, you'll see RBF settings. These settings affect the behavior of the driver once it is active. I'll skip it for now and we'll come back to it after we set up the driver. Then we have inputs. We have to set at least one input, otherwise the driver can't function. This defines which of the bone's transform channels will be used to drive other properties. If you want to optimize the performance, you would only activate the channels that you really need. In this simple example, I'm only going to use the location of the bone, and I'm only going to move the bone up and down. And if you understand how the local axis of bones work, then you'll know that the y-axis is this axis here. So I'm going to activate the y-axis. Next, we have driven properties. These are the properties that will be affected by the driver, which is our bone here. So currently we only have the add button. I'm going to click on it, and as you can see, the type of properties that we can add are single property, transforms, or shape keys. I'm going to talk about all of them sooner or later, but the easiest one to set up is a transform channel. So let's choose transforms. A new menu will pop up asking us which object we want to affect. So I'm going to choose Suzanne here. And then the add-on wants to know which of Suzanne's transform channels I want to affect. In this case, I'm going to want to affect all of them. So I'm just going to put a check mark in all boxes and click OK. If you only wanted to affect locations, then you should only activate the location channels, and that will optimize your driver. And after clicking OK, the add-on created 9 new driven properties for me automatically. And this, by the way, was an user interface improvement that happened a couple of days ago. RBF Drivers was released about a month ago, and it already received a couple of updates, which is very nice to see. Before this update, we had to manually add each of these driven properties, all 9 of them, one by one. And for each, we had to set the type of property, the object, and then the actual axis that we want to use. And that was very time consuming and error prone. So I'm very happy to see this kind of improvements to the add-on. By the way, there is a Discord group for RBF drivers, which is run by James, the creator of this add-on. He usually answers questions within a couple of hours. So if you have questions or suggestions, you should definitely join the group and share them. Sorry for this aside. Now we have our driven properties set up. So I'm going to construct this panel and we can move to the poses. This is the last step in the process. If I now add a pose, a new item will appear and it will be called rest. So the first pose that we add is the rest pose, or default position of our driver setup. As you can see, our driver is still red. We have to add one more pose to make it usable. So we want to add another pose, but pay attention because at first I always confused this part. First, I want to move my objects and create my new pose. So the bone, I'm going to move up a little bit. Next, I want to move Suzanne. So I would have to go to object mode, select Suzanne and move her. But here's a little tip for you. I'll go back to pose mode and under edit, I'm going to untick lock object modes. And that allows me to select Suzanne and she'll be in object mode. And then if I click back to the bone, I'll be in pose mode and I can edit my driver. So let's select Suzanne. I'm going to move her up a little bit and then maybe scale her up on the Z-axis. And then I'll go back to the bone in pose mode. And then I'm going to click the plus sign to create a new pose. And that creates a new pose. And at the same time, it stores the current state of the setup in this pose. The mistake that I did at first, and I still kind of do it, is to first add a pose. So I'm going to add another one. And then I would try to edit my objects. So I moved the bone a little bit. Then I'm going to take Suzanne, move her up a little bit more, scale her down, and then maybe rotate her around a little bit. And now the problem is, these changes that I did are not yet stored in this new pose that I created. This pose basically holds the same values as my previous pose. But we can fix this. With the newest pose highlighted, I'm just going to click this button, which is called Update. Okay? And the current state of all objects will be recorded in this pose. That will be all for a simple little driver. As you can see, the driver itself is no longer red and we have a checkbox next to it, which means that we can activate it. But while we are still here in the pose area, let's look at the other options that we have. Below the update button that we just used, we have another button that looks like a magnifying glass. The tooltip says Apply RBF Pose. This button will show you the state of the objects that was recorded for a pose. So if I highlight the rest pose and click this button, we'll see the default pose. Then I'll select the next one and click it again. And that will show me the state for the next pose. And then I can also preview the final pose. I find the name of this function a bit confusing. I mean, these two buttons, update and apply, sound like they do the same thing, at least to me. Instead of apply, I think the button could be called preview, for example. But anyway, that's what it does. It lets you review the poses that you recorded. And below it, we have the Edit Pose button. If I click it, it will show the values for all of my drivers and driven properties. One of the cool things about this system is that it allows you to set things up intuitively in the viewport. But sometimes you may want precise control, and in this menu, you get precise control. So these are the values for my first pose. Let's say that I want the Y location of the driver bone to be exactly 1 instead of 0.98. So I'm going to type 1 and then click OK. And then I'll go to the other pose. And let's say that instead of 2.37, I want it to be exactly 2.5. I'll enter it and click OK. And that edited my poses. So now the driver is actually complete. I can check this box and the driver will be live. And now if I move the bone up, it will cause Suzanne to go through the poses that I set up. And the most important thing is, what this add-on actually does is it creates automatic interpolation between these poses. Now we can look at the RBF settings that we skipped earlier. These settings control how the add-on interpolates between the poses that we set up. The way I understand it is that RBF uses different algorithms to smooth out or blur the data. You can kind of imagine the different options under interpolation similar to the different types of proportional editing. But since the data is quite complex, this blurring is almost impossible for humans to imagine. I mean, we're blurring location, rotation, and scale values all at once. How do you even imagine this, right? So these options, interpolation and radius, are very hard to describe. Even the official manual of RBF drivers recommends that you simply play with them and see which mode gives you the best results. But one mode that is easy to understand is linear. This mode will basically perform as little blurring or basically no blurring of the data, and your poses will stick very closely to what you set up in here in the poses area. If you do want some smoothing between the poses, your first choice should be the default, which is this multi-quadratic biharmonic and standard deviation. And then you can play around with the radius options or switch to some of the other interpolation modes like Gaussian or inverse. And this smoothing slider will most likely be deprecated. It will disappear in the next version of RBF drivers, so you can safely ignore it. By the way, if you decide to add more poses to this setup, you need to first disable your driver, because once you activate the driver, Suzanne, or whatever you're driving, will become a driven object, and you won't be able to manipulate it at all. So untick this and then start adding more poses. So in 10 or 15 minutes, we'll learn the basics of RBF drivers. As I mentioned in the beginning, let's see how the new system compares to existing tools. I want to emphasize again that this comparison is flawed. We are not comparing apples to apples, but it could be useful, so let's take a quick look. So again, we have parenting, constraints, drivers, and scripting. Parenting is easy, but it is limited in what it can do. Constraints offer more possibilities for a little more effort. Drivers is where it really gets interesting with automation. Parenting and constraints mostly connect the transformations of objects, so they are not very versatile. But with drivers, the sky is the limit. You can connect the exposition of an object to the strength of a light, or whatever you wish. But creating these relationships requires a fair bit of knowledge and experience. Scripting is a slightly different beast, but overall it offers additional possibilities if you're up for the challenge. Let's see how RBF drivers compares. When it comes to ease of use, I think RBF performs well. A big difference between RBF and other tools is that most relationship tools rely on mathematics to create an interaction. So I can set up a relationship in which the x rotation of one bone is equal to the y rotation of another bone multiplied by 0.65, for example. With RBF drivers, on the other hand, the artist sets a number of extreme poses and lets the add-on figure out the details. For most artists, that would feel more natural and intuitive than writing mathematical expressions. So I'll place RBF at the same level as constraints. In some ways it could be easier, in other ways it could be a little bit more involved, but overall I would say it's about the same level of difficulty. As for the complexity of the effect that can be achieved, I would place RBF drivers above the standard Blender drivers. Technically, RBF drivers are built upon the standard drivers. I'll talk about this in a second, but this add-on automatically creates driver equations that would be impossible for most users to write. And these complicated equations can create very complicated relationships. When it comes to versatility, RBF drivers are slightly less versatile than standard drivers. The default drivers can drive almost any property. RBF drivers, on the other hand, have some limitations. I'll explain what can be driven by RBF in the question and answer section that is coming up next. And finally, we have performance. You have to keep in mind that the calculations performed by RBF drivers can be heavy, especially with complex setups. So you have to use them sparingly. And that is how they are intended to be used. They are meant to be used in those special cases where a desired result is too difficult or impossible to achieve with other tools. In conclusion, we can say that RBF drivers are intuitive to use, they can create very complex effects or automations, they are meant to be used for specific purposes, mostly rigging and character animation, and their main weak point is performance, so it is better to use them sparingly. In the next couple of minutes, I want to share with you some of the questions that I had initially and the answers that I found. What can act as a driver? The answer to this question is simple. We kind of answered it in our simple example that we set up. only bones in pose mode can be drivers, and to be more precise, only the transform channels, so location, rotation, and scale, of a bone can act as a driver. You can select which of these channels you want to use in the inputs section. Drivers are attached to a specific bone. This one is actually logical, but I wasn't quite sure about it at first. I was wondering if this driver that I have here was a global item that can be accessed from the whole armature, but that's not the case. It's attached to this particular bone that I have here. Let's rename this driver to something like first driver, and then I'll go to edit mode and press Shift A to create another bone and move it to the side. And now if I go to pose mode, this bone does not have a driver yet, but if I select my original bone, it does have the first driver. And here I can click the add button again. And I'm going to name this driver second driver. And now the second driver is attached to bone 001 and the first driver is attached to the first bone. So that would allow me to drive different properties with different bones. I can also add additional drivers on the same bone. And that way I can drive different properties using different poses of the same bone. What properties can be driven? This question is a little bit more complex. As we saw, when we press the add button for driven properties, we can choose from transforms, shape keys, or single property. We already used transforms for a simple example, so I think they're more or less clear. Shape keys are also easy to work with. Here is a simple example. I have set up a shape key that makes Suzanne's nose longer and an RBF driver that affects this shape key when I move the bone up. And single property will allow you to control other properties. The limitation here is that it has to be an object or bone property. So for meshes and other objects, you'll be able to drive many of the properties in the Object tab. And for bones, you'll be able to drive some of the properties in the Bone tab. An additional limitation is that these properties must be an integer, float, or Boolean value. So for an object, you could control its delta transforms, for example, or these visibility toggles, which are a Boolean value, but you won't be able to drive these drop-down menus, for example. And you probably don't want to, but it's just an example of something that you cannot drive with RBF drivers. You can also create custom properties on the object or bone level, and you'll be able to drive those with an RBF driver. It's kind of important to understand that RBF drivers are built on top of the standard Blender drivers. That's where the name RBF Drivers comes from. That is a really good thing, because once an RBF driver has been set up with this menu and it has been activated, then the add-on is no longer needed. There are default drivers that are set up for Suzanne's location, rotation, and scale channels, and they will work even if I deactivate the add-on. So I can create something with this add-on and then send it to a client, or I can share or even sell a blend file to someone who doesn't have the add-on, but they will be able to use the resulting automation just like I am. That is also the reason for some of the limitations of RBF drivers. That is why we can only use a bone and its transforms as a driver. I don't understand the exact technical reason, but it has something to do with Blender's depth graph. And the creator of the add-on told me that he may be able to make RBF drivers more versatile in the future, but that will only happen when the Everything Nodes project has advanced, which won't be very soon. But once you understand that RBF drivers use default drivers in the background, you'll understand why, after we set up an RBF driver, our monkey has these drivers set up for its transform properties. You can actually edit these drivers, but you shouldn't unless you really know what you're doing. To me personally, this looks completely incomprehensible, so I'm never going to touch it. And that's it. Other questions and answers can be found in the FAQ section of the official manual. In this video, we actually covered a big portion of the manual, but you should look it over anyway. Always read the manual if you're serious about the software. In future videos, I'll try to show you more advanced and practical applications of this system. Let me know in the comments if you have any use cases that you'd like me to cover. And if you decide to buy the add-on, I'd appreciate it if you used my link. That's it. Please click like to let YouTube know that this video is cool and subscribe for future videos. And talk to you next time.